My name is Sarah Martinez. I'm 32 years old, and until 6 months ago, I thought I knew what betrayal looked like. As a forensic accountant for the state of California, I've seen families destroyed by financial fraud, witnessed the devastating aftermath of white-collar crimes, and helped prosecutors build cases against people who stole from their own relatives. I never imagined I'd become the victim in one of these stories, or that the person who would destroy my life would be the brother I'd protected and supported for over a decade. When that federal agent knocked on my door at 7 in the morning with an arrest warrant, I realized that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones capable of the most unthinkable betrayal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Phoenix, Arizona, Marcus and I had been inseparable despite our 4-year age gap. After our father died when I was 14 and Marcus was 10, I naturally stepped into a protective role that would define our relationship for the next 2 decades. Our mother, Carmen, worked double shifts at the hospital as a registered nurse, leaving me to help Marcus with homework, pack his lunches, and make sure he stayed out of trouble while she kept us financially afloat. Marcus had always been charming in that effortless way that made teachers overlook his missing assignments, and convinced our mother that his poor grades were just temporary setbacks. He had this infectious laugh and an ability to talk his way out of almost any situation, skills that I admired, even as I quietly cleaned up the messes he left behind. When he forgot his science project was due, I'd help him throw something together the night before. When he overspent his allowance, I'd loan him money from my babysitting earnings. When he got caught cheating on a test in high school, I helped him write the apology letter that somehow got him a second chance instead of suspension. I told myself I was being a good sister, that family meant supporting each other no matter what. Our mother was already exhausted from working so hard to keep us housed and fed, and I didn't want to add to her stress by letting her know about every small crisis Marcus seemed to stumble into. I was the responsible one, the planner, the one who thought 5 steps ahead, while Marcus lived entirely in the moment. It seemed like a fair division of labor, and I genuinely enjoyed taking care of the people I loved. After high school, I threw myself into my studies at Arizona State University, majoring in accounting with a minor in criminal justice. The combination fascinated me, the way numbers could tell stories, reveal lies, and expose hidden truths. I graduated summa cum laude and immediately landed a position with a mid-sized accounting firm in Scottsdale. Marcus, meanwhile, drifted through community college for 3 years before dropping out to pursue what he called entrepreneurial opportunities, which seemed to change every few months. While I was building my career and saving for my own apartment, Marcus was cycling through jobs and living situations with the kind of chaos that had become his trademark. He'd work at a restaurant until he got fired for showing up late too many times, then convince some friend to let him crash on their couch while he figured out his next move. Our mother worried constantly, but Marcus always managed to charm his way back into her good graces, with promises that this time would be different, that he'd finally found his calling. When I got the opportunity to join the California State Controller's office as a forensic accountant 5 years ago, it felt like the culmination of everything I'd worked toward. The position involved investigating financial fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion cases throughout the state. I'd be working with law enforcement agencies, examining complex financial records, and helping to prosecute people who abused positions of trust for personal gain. The irony of what would later happen to me isn't lost on me now. The work was challenging and meaningful, exactly what I'd hoped for when I first became interested in forensic accounting. Each case was like solving a puzzle, following paper trails and digital footprints to uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. I'd helped recover millions of dollars in stolen funds, assisted in prosecutions that resulted in significant prison sentences, and earned a reputation as someone who could find financial irregularities that others might miss. Marcus visited me in San Diego frequently during my first year there, always full of enthusiasm about his latest business venture. He'd started a consulting company, he told me, helping small businesses optimize their operations and increase profitability. The details were always vague when I asked specific questions, but he seemed more focused and confident than I'd seen him in years. He'd even rented his own apartment in Phoenix and was talking about expanding his client base. I was proud of him for apparently finding his direction, and when he asked to use my address for some business correspondence because his mail was being forwarded slowly from his previous address, I didn't hesitate to agree. It seemed like such a small favor, and I was happy to help him maintain his professional image while he got established. He explained that having a California address would help him attract clients in that market, and since I lived in a nice neighborhood, it would look more impressive on his business cards and website. The request started small and seemingly reasonable. Could he list my address as his business headquarters on his LLC paperwork? Could he use my phone number as a backup contact since he was traveling for client meetings? Could he receive some important financial documents at my address, since his apartment complex had problems with mail theft? Each request came with a logical explanation and Marcus's trademark charm, and I found myself agreeing without much thought. Looking back, I can see how carefully orchestrated it all was, how each small concession paved the way for bigger deceptions. But at the time, I was just happy that my little brother seemed to finally be getting his life together, and I wanted to support his success in any way I could. The warning signs that might have been obvious in one of my professional cases were invisible when filtered through years of family loyalty and my desire to see Marcus succeed. My work kept me busy enough that I didn't pay much attention to the mail that arrived in Marcus's name. Business documents, official-looking envelopes, packages from companies I didn't recognize. He'd pick them up during his visits or arrange for me to forward them to various addresses, always with reasonable explanations about client confidentiality or business requirements. I was focused on my own career and personal life, which had become increasingly fulfilling. I'd started dating David Chen, a software engineer who worked for a cybersecurity firm downtown. We'd met at a professional networking event, bonding over our shared experience of being detail-oriented people in fields that required meticulous attention to accuracy. David was patient, intelligent, and refreshingly straightforward after years of dealing with Marcus's complexity. Our relationship developed slowly and steadily, built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than drama or intensity. David noticed things about Marcus that I'd become blind to through years of familiarity. The way Marcus would deflect direct questions about his business, the vagueness of his explanations, the slight tension that would creep into his voice when pressed for details. David never said anything directly critical, but he'd occasionally ask gentle questions that made me pause and really listen to what Marcus was saying, or more often, what he wasn't saying. During one of Marcus's visits, about 18 months ago, David quietly mentioned that something seemed off about Marcus's business model. He couldn't quite put his finger on what was bothering him, but as someone who worked in security and fraud prevention, he'd
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Developed instincts about when things didn't add up. I defended Marcus, explaining that he'd always been unconventional, but that didn't mean he was doing anything wrong. David dropped the subject, but I could tell he remained skeptical. The first real warning sign came when I received a phone call from the IRS about a discrepancy in my tax filings. The agent was polite but insistent that there were some questions about income I'd reported that didn't match their records. I explained that I was a government employee with straightforward W-2 income and had filed my taxes exactly as I had for years. The agent seemed confused, mentioning business income and deductions that I knew nothing about, but assured me it was probably just a clerical error that could be sorted out with proper documentation. I spent an entire weekend gathering every piece of financial documentation I could find, organizing my records with the kind of obsessive thoroughness that my job had trained me for. Everything was exactly as it should be, my income properly reported, my deductions legitimate and documented. I called the IRS back, confident that we could clear up whatever mistake had been made in their system. The agent I spoke with seemed satisfied with my documentation, but mentioned that the case might take some time to fully resolve since it involved multiple jurisdictions. Multiple jurisdictions. That phrase stuck with me, nagging at the back of my mind as I went about my daily routine. My income came from one source, I lived in one state, I had no business interests or complicated financial arrangements that would involve multiple jurisdictions. I tried to push the worry aside, telling myself that government bureaucracy was notoriously inefficient and that these kinds of mix-ups happened all the time. Marcus's visits became less frequent around this time, and when he did come to San Diego, he seemed distracted and less talkative than usual. He'd always been energetic and full of stories about his business adventures, but now he seemed preoccupied, checking his phone constantly and cutting his visits shorter than he used to. When I asked about his work, he gave even vaguer answers than before, mentioning that he was focusing on different types of clients and exploring new markets. The second warning sign came 3 months later when I received a notice from the California Franchise Tax Board about unpaid business taxes. According to their records, I had failed to file proper returns for a consulting business registered under my name and social security number. The amount owed was substantial, nearly $30,000, including penalties and interest. I stared at the notice in complete bewilderment, reading it multiple times to make sure I understood what it was saying. I had no business. I was a salaried government employee, with no side income, no consulting work, no business registrations of any kind. Yet according to the state of California, I was the owner of Martinez Business Solutions, a consulting firm that had been operating for over 2 years and generating significant income that had never been properly reported or taxed. The business address listed on their records was my home address. The sick feeling in my stomach grew as I researched further, discovering that Martinez Business Solutions was indeed registered as a legitimate business entity in California, Nevada, and Arizona. The registration documents bore my name, my social security number, and my address, along with a signature that looked remarkably similar to mine but that I knew I had never written. The business had been filing tax returns in all 3 states, reporting income and claiming deductions, but apparently not paying the full amount of taxes owed. I called Marcus immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. He didn't answer, and my call went straight to voicemail. I left a message asking him to call me back urgently, that there was a serious problem we needed to discuss. Hours passed without a response. I called again, and again, growing more frantic with each unanswered call. Finally, late that evening, he texted back saying he was in meetings and would call me the next day. The next day came and went without a call. I tried reaching him through social media, through mutual friends. Even called our mother to see if she'd heard from him. Mom said he'd mentioned being busy with a big project, but hadn't given her any details. She could hear the worry in my voice and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what I was beginning to suspect. I needed to talk to Marcus first. Needed to give him a chance to provide some innocent explanation for what appeared to be an impossible situation. When Marcus finally called 3 days later, his voice sounded different. Strained, defensive, like he knew why I was calling before I even started talking. I explained about the tax notices, about the business registration, about the apparent fraud being committed in my name. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that I thought the call had dropped. Marcus's explanation, when it finally came, was a masterpiece of deflection and manipulation. He claimed that someone must have stolen both of our identities, that he'd been dealing with similar problems but hadn't wanted to worry me. He suggested that maybe one of his business contacts had gotten access to our personal information and was using it fraudulently. He sounded convincing, concerned, even angry on my behalf about this violation of our privacy and security. But I'd spent years analyzing financial fraud, learning to recognize the patterns of deception and misdirection that criminals use to cover their tracks. Something in Marcus's tone, in the way he was so quick with explanations and so eager to redirect blame, triggered every professional instinct I'd developed. I found myself listening not just to what he was saying, but to how he was saying it, applying the same analytical skills I used in my casework to my own brother's words. I told Marcus I needed time to process what was happening and to figure out next steps. I didn't mention that I'd already started my own investigation, using the same techniques I employed in my professional work to trace the digital and paper trails of Martinez Business Solutions. What I found over the next several days made me sick to my stomach and furious in ways I'd never experienced before. The business had been meticulously constructed using my personal information, but the operational details revealed Marcus's involvement at every level. The business phone number was registered to a prepaid account that had been purchased with a credit card in Marcus's name. The business email address was linked to an IP address that traced back to Marcus's apartment in Phoenix. Bank accounts for the business had been opened using my social security number, but with Marcus listed as an authorized user, giving him full access to deposits and withdrawals. Most damning of all, the business had been reporting income from consulting services provided to companies that I was able to verify were real clients who had paid substantial amounts for business optimization services. Marcus hadn't just stolen my identity to create a fake business. He'd created a real business using my identity and had been operating it successfully for years, generating significant income while allowing the tax obligations to accumulate unpaid. The scope of the deception was staggering. Marcus had essentially stolen my entire identity to create a parallel financial life, one where he could operate a business, generate income, and build what appeared to be a successful consulting practice, all while leaving me liable for the legal and financial consequences. He'd used my reputation, my credit, my clean legal record as collateral for his entrepreneurial ambitions, never considering or caring about what would happen when the inevitable reckoning came. As I dug deeper into the records, I discovered that the situation was even worse than I'd initially realized. Marcus hadn't just failed to pay taxes on the business income. He'd actively filed fraudulent returns, claiming deductions for expenses that never existed, inflating business costs to minimize tax liability, and in some cases, claiming tax credits that the business wasn't entitled to receive. This wasn't just identity theft or tax evasion. This was sophisticated, systematic fraud that had been going on for years. The paper trail showed that Marcus had been careful to separate his legitimate personal finances from the fraudulent business operations. His own tax returns were properly filed and showed only minimal income from part-time employment, while Martinez Business Solutions was generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue that was being hidden from the tax authorities. He'd essentially created two separate financial identities, his own and mine, allowing him to enjoy the benefits of a successful business while avoiding the obligations that came with that success. I realized that Marcus's frequent visits to San Diego hadn't just been social calls or attempts to maintain our sibling relationship. He'd been managing the business operations from my address, using my home as a base of operations for his fraudulent enterprise. The mail he'd been receiving, the packages, the official documents, they were all part of the elaborate deception he'd constructed using my identity as the foundation. The most heartbreaking discovery was evidence that Marcus had been planning this for years, long before he'd ever asked to use my address for his business correspondence. Records showed that he'd been collecting my personal information systematically, photocopying documents during family visits, memorizing details about my employment and financial situation, even taking pictures of my driver's license and social security card when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Every favor I'd done for him, every piece of information I'd shared, every expression of family loyalty and support had been weaponized against me. Marcus hadn't just betrayed my trust, he'd systematically exploited my love for him to construct an elaborate criminal enterprise that would eventually destroy everything I'd worked to build in my professional and personal life. The realization that my own brother had been planning to ruin my life for years, had been calculating every interaction and manipulating every conversation to serve his criminal purposes, was more devastating than any financial loss could have been. I'd always known Marcus was irresponsible and self-centered, but I'd never imagined he was capable of such calculated, long-term deception. As I sat in my home office, surrounded by printouts and documents that proved beyond any doubt what Marcus had done, I felt a kind of betrayal that cut deeper than anything I'd ever experienced professionally. This wasn't just fraud or identity theft. This was the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about family, loyalty, and the bonds that were supposed to connect siblings. Marcus had turned my love for him into a weapon against me, and the precision with which he'd executed his plan showed that he'd never seen me as a sister to be protected, but as a mark to be exploited. The full scope of the criminal enterprise became clear as I traced the business operations across multiple states. Martinez Business Solutions had been providing legitimate consulting services to real clients, which explained why the business had been so successful and why Marcus had been able to maintain the deception for so long. He wasn't just running a fake business. He was running a real business using stolen identity, which made the fraud both more sophisticated and more damaging. The clients who had hired Martinez Business Solutions believed they were working with Sarah Martinez, a forensic accountant with an impressive professional background and government credentials. Marcus had stolen not just my identity but my reputation, using my educational achievements and professional experience as marketing tools for his consulting services. He'd built his business success on the foundation of my hard work and accomplishments, then left me to face the legal consequences when the tax obligations became too substantial to ignore. I spent the next week documenting everything I'd discovered, creating the kind of comprehensive case file that I would have prepared for any fraud investigation in my professional capacity. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but I knew that proving my innocence would be infinitely more difficult than proving Marcus's guilt. In cases of identity theft and tax fraud, the burden of proof often falls on the victim to demonstrate that they weren't complicit in the criminal activity. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. As a forensic accountant specializing in financial fraud, I understood better than most people how difficult it would be to convince authorities that I had no knowledge of a sophisticated business operation that had been conducted using my identity for years. The very skills that made me effective at my job would work against me in this situation, as investigators would find it hard to believe that someone with my background and expertise could be completely unaware of such extensive financial activity. David was the first person I told about what I'd discovered, and his reaction confirmed my worst fears about how others would respond to my situation. Even though he'd been suspicious of Marcus from the beginning, even though he knew me well enough to recognize that I would never be involved in anything illegal, he struggled to understand how I could have been completely unaware of what was happening. If someone who loved me and knew my character intimately had doubts about my innocence, how would strangers and law enforcement agencies react to my claims? The decision to confront Marcus directly was one of the hardest I'd ever made. Part of me hoped that there was still some explanation, some misunderstanding that could account for what appeared to be deliberate, calculated fraud. But a larger part of me knew that confrontation was inevitable, and that I needed to give Marcus an opportunity to confess and potentially cooperate in unwinding the damage he'd caused. When I called Marcus this time, I didn't leave messages or wait for callbacks. I kept calling until he answered, and when he finally picked up, I could hear the resignation in his voice. He knew that his carefully constructed deception had finally been discovered, and he seemed almost relieved that the pretense was over. Marcus's confession, when it came, was matter-of-fact rather than apologetic. He admitted to everything I'd discovered and more, explaining his actions with the same casual attitude he'd always shown toward rules and consequences. He'd seen an opportunity to use my credentials and reputation to build a successful business, and he'd taken it without seriously considering the long-term implications for either of us. The most chilling part of Marcus's confession was his apparent belief that what he'd done wasn't really that serious, that it was just another example of his entrepreneurial creativity and willingness to take risks. He seemed genuinely surprised by my anger and distress, suggesting that I was overreacting to what he viewed as a temporary arrangement that had gotten a bit out of hand. Marcus's plan, such as it was, had apparently involved eventually coming clean about the business operations and helping me sort out the tax issues once he'd made enough money to pay everything back with interest. He claimed that he'd always intended to make things right, that he'd just needed more time to generate enough revenue to cover all the accumulated obligations. The naivete of this explanation would have been laughable if it weren't so devastating. Marcus seemed to genuinely believe that he could commit years of systematic fraud, accumulate hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid tax obligations, and then simply write a check to make everything disappear. He had no understanding of the legal jeopardy he'd created for both of us, no appreciation for the professional and personal damage that would result from his actions, regardless of whether the money was eventually paid back. When I explained to Marcus that I was already under investigation by multiple tax authorities, that there were criminal implications beyond just financial obligations, he finally seemed to grasp the seriousness of what he'd done. His casual confidence, evaporated, replaced by panic and desperate attempts to minimize his responsibility and find ways to shift blame to others. Marcus's suggestions for resolving the situation were as unrealistic as his original plan had been naive. He proposed that we could claim that both of our identities had been stolen by unknown criminals, that we could destroy evidence of his involvement and present ourselves as joint victims of identity theft. He seemed to believe that his ability to talk his way out of trouble which had served him well in minor situations throughout his life, would somehow be sufficient to overcome the extensive documentary evidence of his fraud. The conversation ended with Marcus promising to think about the best way to handle the situation and suggesting that we should both consult attorneys before taking any action. He still seemed to believe that there was some way to minimize the consequences for himself while somehow protecting me from the worst of the fallout. His inability to fully accept responsibility for what he'd done, even when confronted with undeniable evidence, showed me that the brother I'd loved and protected for so many years had been a fiction, a carefully constructed persona designed to hide the calculating criminal who had been systematically destroying my life. That night I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything, except the magnitude of what Marcus had done, and the impossibility of the situation I found myself in. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, every goal I'd achieved in my professional and personal life, was now at risk because of decisions made by someone I'd trusted completely. The next morning brought a new development that made Marcus's suggestions about destroying evidence and claiming joint victimhood impossible. A federal agent from the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS was standing at my front door with a warrant for my arrest on charges of tax evasion, filing false tax returns, and conspiracy to commit fraud across multiple jurisdictions. As the agent read me my rights, I realized that Marcus's carefully planned deception had not only stolen my identity and destroyed my financial life, but had also made me a fugitive from justice in 3 different states. The criminal enterprise he'd built using my name had grown so large, and the tax obligations had become so substantial that federal authorities had gotten involved, treating this not as a simple case of unpaid taxes, but as a sophisticated multi-state fraud operation. Standing in my own doorway in handcuffs, I understood that proving my innocence would require not just evidence, but a complete reconstruction of how the fraud had been perpetrated, and why someone with my background and expertise should be believed when I claimed to know nothing about a business operation that had been conducted in my name for years. The worst part was knowing that somewhere in Phoenix, Marcus was probably just waking up to another ordinary day, still believing that his charm and creativity would somehow allow him to escape the consequences of what he'd done. While I was being arrested for crimes I didn't commit, he was free to continue his life, probably already working on his next scheme, or planning his next deception. As the federal agent escorted me to his car, my neighbors watching from their windows and David rushing over from his apartment across the street, I realized that my fight for justice was just beginning, and that the skills I'd developed as a forensic accountant would now need to be turned toward proving my own innocence rather than exposing other people's crimes. The holding cell at the federal building was nothing like the sterile, organized environment I was accustomed to in my professional life. The concrete walls seemed to press in around me as I sat on the metal bench, still wearing the clothes I'd thrown on when the agents arrived at my door. The reality of my situation felt surreal, like I was trapped in someone else's nightmare rather than living my own life. Agent Patricia Hoffman, the lead investigator on my case, was a woman in her late 40s with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of my appearance and demeanor. She'd been investigating financial crimes for over 2 decades, and her reputation for thoroughness was legendary among the forensic accounting community. Under different circumstances, I would have been honored to work with someone of her caliber. Instead, I found myself on the opposite side of an interrogation table, trying to convince her that I was the victim rather than the perpetrator of one of the most sophisticated identity theft schemes she'd encountered. The evidence against me was overwhelming, presented in neat manila folders that contained years of financial records, business correspondence, and official documents. Agent Hoffman spread the papers across the table between us, with the methodical precision of someone who had done this countless times before. Bank statements showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in business transactions. Tax returns filed in my name claiming deductions for office expenses, business travel, and equipment purchases. Incorporation documents bearing my signature establishing Martinez Business Solutions in California, Nevada, and Arizona. Each piece of evidence was damning in its specificity and apparent authenticity. The signatures looked genuine because Marcus had practiced forging my handwriting for years, perfecting the subtle flourishes and letter formations that made my signature distinctive. The business addresses were legitimate because he'd used my actual home address and various mail forwarding services to create the appearance of multiple business locations. The financial transactions were real because Marcus had been operating an actual consulting business, providing genuine services to clients who believed they were hiring Sarah Martinez, forensic accountant. Agent Hoffman's questions were sharp and focused, designed to probe for inconsistencies in my story and to test whether my claims of innocence could withstand detailed scrutiny. She wanted to know how I could have been unaware of business operations conducted in my name for over 3 years. She questioned whether someone with my educational background and professional experience could realistically claim ignorance about tax obligations and business registration requirements. She challenged my assertion that I had no knowledge of the clients who had paid substantial fees for consulting services supposedly provided by me. The most difficult questions to answer were those that touched on the legitimate aspects of Marcus's operation. Martinez Business Solutions hadn't been a completely fictitious entity designed to hide criminal activity. It had been a real business providing actual services to genuine clients who received value for their payments. The consulting work Marcus had performed was competent and professional, which explained why the business had been successful enough to generate the substantial income that had attracted the attention of tax authorities. Marcus had been clever in his approach, using my credentials and reputation to establish credibility with potential clients while actually delivering the services he promised. This made the fraud more sophisticated than simple identity theft, because there was legitimate business activity underlying the criminal use of my personal information. Clients weren't victims in the traditional sense. They had received the consulting services they'd paid for, even though they'd been deceived about the identity of the person providing those services. Agent Hoffman explained that the complexity of the scheme was part of what made it so legally problematic for me. Simple identity theft cases, where criminals use stolen personal information to make purchases or open credit accounts, are easier to resolve because the victims can demonstrate that they received no benefit from the fraudulent activities. In my situation, the business had been successful and profitable, which could suggest to investigators that I had been involved in or benefiting from the criminal enterprise. The financial records showed a level of sophistication that went beyond what most identity theft victims experience. Marcus hadn't just stolen my social security number to open a few credit cards or take out loans in my name. He'd created an entire parallel financial identity, complete with business operations, client relationships, and ongoing revenue streams. The business had its own bank accounts, credit cards, and financial history, spanning multiple years in multiple states. Most troubling was the evidence suggesting that I should have been aware of at least some aspects of the business operations. Mail had been delivered to my address regularly for years. Business phone calls had been forwarded to numbers associated with my residence. Official government correspondence regarding business registrations and tax obligations had been sent to my home address. Agent Hoffman found it difficult to believe that someone could remain completely oblivious to such extensive business activity connected to their personal information and residence. I tried to explain the gradual way Marcus had introduced these elements into my life, how each request had seemed reasonable and temporary, how his explanations had always sounded plausible in the context of his legitimate business development efforts. But even as I spoke, I could hear how naive and gullible my explanations sounded to someone who investigated fraud for a living. The pattern of gradual escalation that Marcus had used was a classic technique employed by financial criminals to normalize increasingly suspicious activities. Agent Hoffman pointed out that my professional background made my claims of ignorance particularly implausible. As a forensic accountant, I was trained to notice financial irregularities and suspicious patterns. I regularly investigated cases involving exactly the type of schemes that Marcus had perpetrated using my identity. How could someone with my expertise and experience fail to recognize the warning signs of fraud being committed in their own name? The question cut to the heart of my professional identity and personal shame. I had been blind to Marcus's deception precisely because I'd never applied my professional skepticism to my family relationships. The analytical skills that made me effective at detecting fraud in other people's financial records had been completely absent when it came to my brother's activities. I'd allowed family loyalty and emotional attachment to override the critical thinking that defined my career. Agent Hoffman's investigation had uncovered details about Marcus's operation that even I hadn't discovered during my own research. She showed me records of business trips Marcus had taken using travel expenses charged to Martinez Business Solutions credit cards, hotel receipts from client meetings in Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and Denver, rental car charges for transportation to consulting engagements, restaurant bills for business meals with prospective clients. Marcus had been living a completely separate professional life using my identity, traveling extensively and meeting with business contacts who knew him as Sarah Martinez. He'd created business cards, a professional website, and marketing materials all featuring my name and credentials. He'd even established a LinkedIn profile using my photograph and professional background, connecting with potential clients and industry contacts who believed they were communicating with me. The sophistication of the deception was breathtaking in its thoroughness and attention to detail. Marcus hadn't just stolen my identity. He'd assumed my entire professional persona, using my education, experience, and reputation as the foundation for a successful consulting practice. Every achievement in my career, every skill I'd developed, every professional relationship I'd built, had been appropriated and weaponized for his criminal enterprise. Agent Hoffman explained that the investigation had been triggered by discrepancies identified during a routine audit of California state tax filings. Martinez Business Solutions had been reporting substantial income but paying proportionally low taxes, claiming deductions and credits that didn't align with typical business operations. When auditors attempted to contact the business owner to clarify the discrepancies, they discovered that Sarah Martinez was employed full-time by the state government and claimed to have no knowledge of any business operations. The initial assumption had been that I was attempting to hide income from my consulting business to avoid paying appropriate taxes. It was only when the investigation expanded to include multiple states and federal authorities that the true scope of the identity theft became apparent. Marcus had been filing tax returns in all 3 states where the business was registered, often reporting conflicting information about income and expenses, creating a paper trail that suggested either gross incompetence or deliberate fraud. The federal involvement had been triggered when investigators discovered that some of Marcus's clients were government contractors, raising the possibility that fraudulent business credentials had been used to obtain contracts funded by federal money. This elevated the case from a simple tax evasion matter to a potential fraud against the United States government, which carried much more serious criminal penalties and would be prosecuted in federal court rather than state courts. Agent Hoffman showed me correspondence between Marcus, operating as Sarah Martinez, and several federal contractors who had hired Martinez Business Solutions to optimize their operations and ensure compliance with government contracting requirements. These clients had paid premium rates for consulting services, believing they were hiring a forensic accountant with government experience and security clearance. Marcus had provided competent services, but he'd used fraudulent credentials to obtain contracts that he would never have been eligible for under his own name. The implications were staggering. Not only was I facing charges for tax evasion and identity fraud, but I was also potentially implicated in fraud against federal contractors and the United States government. The criminal penalties for these offenses could include decades in federal prison, even for first-time offenders. My entire life, everything I'd worked to build and achieve, was at risk because of decisions made by someone I'd trusted completely. Agent Hoffman's demeanor began to soften slightly as she continued reviewing the evidence. Her experience investigating financial crimes had taught her to recognize patterns of behavior that distinguished genuine criminals from their victims. Something about my responses, my obvious distress at learning details about Marcus's operation, and the consistency of my story despite intensive questioning, was beginning to convince her that I might actually be telling the truth about my ignorance of the business activities. The breakthrough came when Agent Hoffman showed me a series of emails between Marcus and potential clients, correspondence that had been conducted through business email accounts established in my name. The writing style, the tone, the specific language Marcus used when discussing consulting services was completely different from my own professional communication style. An expert analysis of the emails would likely reveal that they hadn't been written by the same person who authored my legitimate professional correspondence. More importantly, the emails contained technical errors and misstatements about accounting principles and government regulations that I would never have made. Marcus's consulting services had been competent, but not expert level. and his communication with clients revealed gaps in knowledge that would be unusual for someone with my educational background and professional experience. These subtle differences provided evidence that the business had been operated by someone other than Sarah Martinez, forensic accountant. Agent Hoffman explained that the investigation team had been comparing the business communications with samples of my legitimate professional writing, looking for linguistic patterns and technical knowledge that could help determine whether the same person had authored both sets of documents. The analysis was ongoing, but preliminary results suggested significant differences in writing style, vocabulary, and technical expertise. She also mentioned that investigators had been reviewing surveillance footage from bank branches, where Martinez Business Solutions accounts had been accessed. While the accounts had been opened using my personal information, the person conducting transactions had been male, approximately 6 feet tall, with brown hair and facial features that didn't match my appearance. Marcus had been careful to avoid using his real name for business transactions, but he hadn't been able to avoid security cameras when making deposits and withdrawals from business accounts. The physical evidence was crucial for establishing that I hadn't been personally involved in the day-to-day operations of the fraudulent business. While identity theft victims can sometimes be implicated in criminal activities if investigators believe they were complicit in or benefited from the crimes, the surveillance footage provided objective proof that I hadn't been the person conducting business transactions or managing the accounts. Agent Hoffman's questions became more focused on gathering information about Marcus rather than challenging my claims of innocence. She wanted to know about his personal history, his previous attempts at entrepreneurship, his financial situation, and his access to my personal information. She was particularly interested in understanding how Marcus had acquired the detailed knowledge of my professional background and credentials that he'd used to establish credibility with clients. I explained about the years of family loyalty and support I'd provided, the way I'd shared information about my career and achievements during family conversations, the documents and personal information Marcus had access to during his visits to my home. Each piece of information I'd shared innocently had been cataloged and used to build the fictional version of Sarah Martinez that Marcus had presented to the business world. The agent took detailed notes as I described Marcus's personality, his history of irresponsible behavior, his ability to charm and manipulate people into believing his explanations for various problems and setbacks. She seemed particularly interested in the pattern of escalating requests Marcus had made over the years, the way he'd gradually normalized increasingly significant impositions on my time and resources. Agent Hoffman explained that the investigation would now focus on locating Marcus and gathering evidence about his role in operating the fraudulent business. While I was still technically under investigation, the evidence was increasingly pointing toward me being a victim, rather than a perpetrator of the crimes. However, she warned that proving my innocence completely would require Marcus's cooperation or overwhelming evidence of his sole responsibility for the criminal activities. The legal process would be complex and lengthy, potentially involving multiple jurisdictions and federal agencies. Even if criminal charges against me were eventually dropped, I would still face civil liability for the unpaid taxes and penalties accumulated by the fraudulent business. The financial obligations alone could bankrupt me, even if I was never convicted of any criminal wrongdoing. Agent Hoffman arranged for me to be released pending further investigation, but with strict conditions that severely limited my freedom and professional activities. I was required to surrender my passport, report to a federal probation officer regularly, and notify authorities before traveling outside the state. Most devastating professionally, I was suspended from my position with the state controller's office pending resolution of the criminal investigation. The suspension meant not only the loss of my income but also the destruction of my professional reputation. Even if I was ultimately cleared of all criminal charges, the mere fact of being investigated for financial fraud would make it nearly impossible to continue working as a forensic accountant. The field required absolute integrity and trustworthiness, and any hint of involvement in financial crimes, even as a victim, could permanently damage career prospects. David was waiting for me when I was finally released from federal custody, his face a mixture of relief and concern. He'd spent the entire day making phone calls, trying to find attorneys who specialized in federal criminal defense, particularly cases involving identity theft and financial fraud. The legal fees alone would be substantial, potentially requiring me to liquidate my savings and retirement accounts to fund my defense. The ride home was silent, both of us struggling to process the magnitude of what Marcus had done and the challenges that lay ahead. David had taken time off work to support me through the crisis, but I could see the strain in his expression, the way this situation was testing our relationship in ways neither of us had anticipated. Even though he believed in my innocence, the practical implications of being involved with someone under federal investigation were significant. My neighbors had seen the federal agents at my door that morning, and word was already spreading through the community about my arrest. The suburban neighborhood where I'd built a quiet, respectable life was buzzing with speculation and gossip about the woman who'd been taken away in handcuffs by federal agents. The privacy and anonymity I'd always valued were permanently shattered. Inside my home, everything looked exactly the same, but nothing felt familiar anymore. This space that had been my sanctuary, my refuge from the stresses of work and the complexities of family relationships, had been revealed as the headquarters of a criminal enterprise I'd known nothing about. Every piece of mail Marcus had received here, every phone call he'd taken, every document he'd reviewed had been part of an elaborate deception that had ultimately destroyed my life. I found myself wandering through the rooms, seeing everything with new eyes, wondering what other evidence of Marcus's activities might be hidden in places I hadn't thought to look. Agent Hoffman had obtained a warrant to search my home, and federal investigators would be returning to conduct a thorough examination of my personal belongings, computer files, and any other materials that might provide evidence about the fraudulent business operations. The thought of strangers going through my most personal possessions, reading my private correspondence, and examining my financial records was humiliating and invasive. Even though I had nothing to hide, the process would be intrusive and degrading, treating me like a criminal suspect in my own home. Every aspect of my private life would be scrutinized for evidence of involvement in or knowledge of Marcus's crimes. That evening, I tried calling Marcus repeatedly, desperate for some explanation or acknowledgement of what he'd done to my life. His phone went straight to voicemail, and I suspected he'd already disconnected the number or abandoned the device entirely. Marcus was probably already implementing whatever escape plan he'd developed for this situation, possibly fleeing to another state, or even leaving the country to avoid prosecution. The realization that Marcus might escape consequences entirely, while I faced years of legal battles and financial ruin, was almost unbearable. He'd had years to prepare for this moment, to plan his exit strategy and secure resources that would allow him to disappear or start over somewhere else. Meanwhile, I was trapped in a legal system that presumed my guilt until I could prove my innocence, facing charges for crimes I didn't even understand completely. David tried to comfort me, but I could see the questions in his eyes, the doubts that even someone who loved me couldn't completely suppress when faced with such overwhelming evidence of criminal activity connected to my name. If the person closest to me was struggling to reconcile my claims of innocence with the scope of the fraud, how could I expect strangers to believe my story? The next morning brought a new crisis that demonstrated how thoroughly Marcus had compromised my financial life. My bank called to inform me that several of my accounts had been frozen by federal order, pending the investigation into Martinez Business Solutions. The authorities were treating all financial accounts associated with my name and social security number as potentially connected to the criminal enterprise, leaving me with limited access to my own money. The frozen accounts included not just my checking and savings accounts, but also my retirement funds, investment accounts, and even a small inheritance I'd received from my grandfather several years earlier. Everything I'd worked to accumulate over my entire adult life was suddenly inaccessible, treated as potential proceeds from criminal activity until I could prove otherwise. David offered to help with immediate expenses, but I couldn't accept financial support that might later be construed as evidence of hidden assets or undisclosed income. Every financial transaction I made would be scrutinized by investigators looking for evidence of my involvement in the fraudulent business operations. Even legitimate gifts or loans from family and friends could be misinterpreted as attempts to hide money or transfer assets to avoid seizure. The practical implications of having my accounts frozen were immediate and severe. I couldn't pay my mortgage, utilities, or other monthly expenses. My credit cards were also frozen, leaving me essentially without access to funds for basic necessities. The federal government had effectively made me financially destitute while investigating whether I'd committed financial crimes, creating a situation where I was being punished before being convicted of anything. I spent the day meeting with criminal defense attorneys, trying to find someone who specialized in cases involving identity theft and federal financial crimes. The attorneys I consulted were sympathetic but realistic about the challenges ahead. Proving innocence in identity theft cases is notoriously difficult, particularly when the victim has professional expertise that investigators believe should have prevented them from being deceived so thoroughly. The legal fees would be substantial, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars for a case involving multiple jurisdictions and complex financial evidence. Most attorneys required significant retainers up front, money I didn't have access to because of the frozen accounts. The irony was bitter. I needed money to prove I hadn't stolen money, but I couldn't access my own money because authorities believed it might have been stolen. Finally, I found an attorney named Rebecca Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname, who specialized in representing professionals accused of white-collar crimes. Rebecca had handled several cases involving identity theft and financial fraud, and she understood the unique challenges faced by victims who were presumed to be perpetrators because of their professional backgrounds. Rebecca's assessment of my situation was sobering, but not hopeless. The evidence of Marcus's sole responsibility for the criminal activities was strong, particularly the surveillance footage and the linguistic analysis of business communications. However, proving my complete innocence would require demonstrating not just that Marcus had operated the business, but that I'd had no knowledge of or involvement in any aspect of the criminal enterprise. The challenge would be explaining how someone with my professional background could have remained ignorant of such extensive business activities conducted in my name. Rebecca suggested that we focus on establishing a timeline of Marcus's deceptive practices, showing how he'd gradually escalated his use of my personal information, and how each stage of the fraud had been carefully designed to avoid arousing my suspicions. Rebecca also explained that my cooperation with the investigation would be crucial for establishing my credibility and demonstrating my genuine desire to see justice done. She arranged for me to provide additional information to Agent Hoffman, including detailed accounts of my interactions with Marcus and any evidence I might have overlooked during my initial investigation of his activities. The meeting with Rebecca gave me the first sense of hope I'd felt since this nightmare began. While the challenges ahead were significant, I finally had an advocate who understood the legal complexities of my situation and who believed in my innocence. More importantly, I had someone who could navigate the federal legal system on my behalf and protect my rights during the ongoing investigation. That evening, as I sat in my living room trying to process everything that had happened, I received a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief but unmistakably from Marcus. His distinctive mix of casual tone and complete lack of accountability was immediately recognizable, despite the unfamiliar phone number. "Sorry, things got complicated. We'll try to sort this out somehow. Lay low for now." The message infuriated me more than anything else that had happened since this crisis began. After years of systematic fraud that had destroyed my life and career, Marcus's response was to suggest that things had gotten complicated and to advise me to lay low. There was no acknowledgement of responsibility, no expression of remorse, no offer to confess or cooperate with authorities to clear my name. I immediately forwarded the message to Rebecca and Agent Hoffman, evidence that Marcus was aware of the investigation and was apparently planning to avoid, rather than address the consequences of his actions. The message also suggested that he had access to resources and communication methods that would allow him to continue evading law enforcement, at least temporarily. Agent Hoffman confirmed that the investigation team was actively searching for Marcus, but he had apparently anticipated this moment and had prepared accordingly. His apartment in Phoenix had been abandoned, with neighbors reporting that he'd moved out suddenly several days earlier. His official employment had been terminated months ago, and he'd been supporting himself entirely through the fraudulent consulting business. The search for Marcus was complicated by the fact that he'd been operating under multiple identities and using various aliases for different aspects of his business operations. While Martinez Business Solutions was registered in my name, Marcus had established other business entities and financial accounts using different combinations of real and fictitious personal information. Unraveling the full scope of his criminal activities would take months or even years. Meanwhile, I remained in legal limbo, suspended from my job, unable to access my financial accounts and facing potential criminal charges that could result in decades in federal prison. The injustice of the situation was overwhelming. I was being punished for crimes committed by someone else, while the actual perpetrator was free to continue his life somewhere beyond the reach of law enforcement. The stress was taking a physical toll that I hadn't anticipated. I'd always been healthy and energetic, able to handle the demanding workload of my forensic accounting position without difficulty. But the combination of legal pressure, financial uncertainty, and emotional betrayal was affecting my sleep, appetite, and ability to concentrate on even simple tasks. David noticed the changes in my behavior and suggested that I consider counseling or therapy to help process the trauma of what Marcus had done. The idea initially seemed unnecessary. I had always been self-reliant and capable of handling stress without outside help. But as the days passed and the full implications of my situation became clearer, I realized that I needed professional support to cope with the psychological impact of such complete betrayal by someone I'd trusted unconditionally. The therapist I eventually found, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, specialized in helping victims of financial crimes and family betrayal. She explained that what I was experiencing was a form of complex trauma, involving not just the practical consequences of identity theft, but also the emotional devastation of discovering that a fundamental relationship in my life had been based on deception and exploitation. Dr. Walsh helped me understand that my feelings of shame and self-blame were common among victims of sophisticated fraud schemes. The criminals who perpetrate these crimes are skilled at exploiting their victims' trust and goodwill, using emotional manipulation and gradual escalation to normalize increasingly inappropriate requests and behaviors. She also explained that my professional background, rather than making me more culpable for missing the warning signs, actually made me more vulnerable to this particular type of deception. Marcus had specifically targeted my expertise and reputation as tools for his criminal enterprise, using my professional identity as a weapon against me in ways that someone outside the financial services industry might not have been able to accomplish. The therapy sessions provided a safe space to process the anger, grief, and confusion I was feeling about Marcus's betrayal. Dr. Walsh helped me recognize that my love and support for my brother hadn't been misplaced or naive, but had been systematically exploited by someone who had never deserved that trust. The fault lay entirely with Marcus, not with me for failing to anticipate such calculated deception. As the weeks passed, Agent Hoffman's investigation continued to uncover evidence that supported my claims of innocence, while revealing new aspects of Marcus's criminal activities. The business had been even more successful than initially apparent, generating over $1 million in revenue during its 3-year operation. Marcus had been living well off the proceeds, maintaining an expensive lifestyle that he'd hidden from our family through careful compartmentalization of his legal and illegal activities. The investigation also revealed that I wasn't Marcus's only victim. He'd used variations of the same scheme to defraud other family members and acquaintances, stealing personal information to establish credit accounts and business entities that had left several people facing financial ruin and legal jeopardy. The pattern of behavior suggested that Marcus was a serial fraudster who had been refining his techniques over many years. This discovery was both validating and horrifying. It confirmed that I hadn't been uniquely gullible or naive in falling victim to Marcus's deception, but it also revealed that he'd been systematically victimizing people who trusted him for much longer than I'd realized. The brother I'd thought I knew had been a complete fiction, a carefully constructed persona designed to hide the predatory criminal who had been exploiting our family relationships for his own gain. Agent Hoffman arranged for me to meet with some of Marcus's other victims, thinking that our shared experiences might provide useful information for the investigation. The meeting was one of the most difficult conversations I'd ever had, listening to stories that paralleled my own experience while recognizing the common patterns of manipulation and exploitation that Marcus had used against all of us. Each victim had a similar story of gradual escalation, reasonable requests that had slowly evolved into major impositions, explanations that had seemed plausible at the time but were revealed as elaborate lies when examined retrospectively. Marcus had been careful to tailor his approach to each victim's specific vulnerabilities, using my professional success, another victim's compassionate nature, and yet another's desire to help family members as entry points for his criminal schemes. The meeting also provided hope, as several of Marcus's other victims had successfully cleared their names and recovered from the financial damage he'd caused. The process had been lengthy and expensive, requiring extensive legal representation and detailed documentation of the fraud, but it was possible to rebuild from the devastation he'd created. One victim, a middle-aged teacher named Patricia Rodriguez, had been fighting charges related to Marcus's use of her identity for over 2 years. She'd finally been cleared of all criminal charges and had successfully recovered most of her financial losses through civil litigation and insurance claims. Her experience provided a roadmap for my own legal battle and hope that justice was ultimately possible. Patricia's advice was practical and encouraging. She emphasized the importance of documenting everything, maintaining detailed records of all interactions with law enforcement and legal representatives, and staying focused on the long-term goal of clearing my name rather than getting overwhelmed by the immediate challenges. She also stressed the importance of self-care and emotional support, recognizing that the psychological impact of such betrayal could be as devastating as the legal and financial consequences. As I left that meeting, I felt a mixture of emotions: hope that my situation could ultimately be resolved, anger at the scope of Marcus's criminal activities, and determination to see him brought to justice for what he'd done to so many innocent people. The fight ahead would be difficult, but I was no longer facing it alone, and I had evidence that victory was possible with persistence and proper legal representation. The investigation was beginning to turn the corner, with Agent Hoffman expressing increasing confidence that the evidence would ultimately exonerate me while building a strong case against Marcus. The challenge now was locating him and compelling his cooperation in unwinding the damage he'd caused. Until Marcus was apprehended and held accountable for his crimes, all of his victims would remain in legal and financial limbo, unable to fully rebuild their lives or recover from the devastation he'd created. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in October, 4 months after my arrest, when Agent Hoffman called with news that would finally begin to vindicate everything I'd been claiming. The FBI had tracked Marcus to a small coastal town in Oregon, where he'd been operating yet another fraudulent business under an assumed identity. He'd been arrested during a routine traffic stop when the fake driver's license he was using triggered an alert in the federal database. Marcus's arrest was the culmination of an intensive manhunt that had involved multiple federal agencies and state law enforcement organizations. The scope of his criminal activities had expanded far beyond what anyone had initially realized, encompassing not just identity theft and tax fraud, but also money laundering, mail fraud, and violations of federal banking regulations. The charges against him would likely result in decades in federal prison, assuming he was convicted on even a fraction of the alleged offenses. Agent Hoffman explained that Marcus's capture had been facilitated by his inability to completely abandon the lifestyle he'd built using stolen identities. Despite having access to substantial amounts of cash from his fraudulent operations, he'd continued trying to operate businesses and maintain the appearance of legitimate success. His compulsive need for recognition and admiration had ultimately led to his downfall, as he couldn't resist the temptation to create new schemes, even when he should have been focused on evading detection. The evidence seized from Marcus's Oregon hideout provided the final pieces of proof needed to establish my innocence beyond any reasonable doubt. Federal investigators found detailed records of his identity theft operations, including step-by-step documentation of how he'd stolen and used personal information from dozens of victims over a period of nearly a decade. The records included specific notes about me, describing my professional background, my personality traits, and the strategies he'd used to manipulate me into providing access to my personal information. Most damning was Marcus's personal journal, which contained candid admissions of his criminal activities and his complete lack of remorse for the damage he'd caused to his victims' lives. The journal entries revealed a calculating, predatory mindset that viewed family relationships and personal trust as resources to be exploited rather than bonds to be honored. Reading excerpts from the journal was both validating and heartbreaking, confirming that the brother I'd loved and protected had never really existed. Marcus had written extensively about his techniques for manipulating different types of victims, treating identity theft like a business strategy rather than a devastating crime. He'd categorized his targets based on their vulnerabilities, professional backgrounds, and potential value for his schemes. I was described in clinical terms as an ideal victim because of my financial expertise, clean credit history, and trusting nature. The cold, analytical way he'd assessed and exploited my love for him was more painful than any of the legal or financial consequences I'd endured. The journal also contained evidence that Marcus had been planning his eventual escape for years, establishing false identities and financial accounts in multiple states as insurance against the possibility of discovery. He'd viewed his criminal activities as a temporary arrangement that would eventually require an exit strategy, but he'd apparently planned to continue victimizing people indefinitely, rather than legitimately rebuilding his life. Agent Hoffman arranged for me to review portions of the evidence that directly related to my case, though much of the material remained classified as part of the ongoing investigation into Marcus's other criminal activities. Seeing the documented proof of his systematic deception was both relieving and devastating, providing the vindication I desperately needed while confirming the complete betrayal of everything I'd believed about our family relationship. The physical evidence supporting my innocence was overwhelming. In addition to the journal entries and identity theft documentation, investigators had found surveillance equipment Marcus had used to monitor my daily routines and gather information about my professional activities. He'd apparently been conducting reconnaissance on my life for years, treating me like a target for intelligence gathering, rather than a sister who loved and supported him. Marcus had also maintained detailed financial records, showing exactly how he'd used the proceeds from Martinez Business Solutions and his other fraudulent enterprises. The money had funded an extravagant lifestyle that included expensive cars, luxury travel, and high-end electronics, all carefully hidden from family members who might have questioned how he could afford such purchases on his reported income. He'd been living like a wealthy businessman while allowing his victims to face criminal charges and financial ruin for his activities. Rebecca worked with federal prosecutors to expedite the process of clearing my name and dropping all charges against me. The evidence of Marcus's sole responsibility for the crimes was so comprehensive that prosecutors acknowledged they'd never had a viable case against me, though they explained that the initial investigation had been necessary to rule out the possibility of my involvement or complicity. The formal announcement that all charges against me were being dropped came during a brief court hearing where the prosecutor publicly acknowledged that I'd been the victim rather than the perpetrator of the crimes under investigation. The judge expunged my arrest record and apologized for the ordeal I'd endured, though she noted that the investigation had been conducted appropriately, given the initial evidence suggesting my potential involvement. Walking out of the federal courthouse as a free woman rather than a criminal defendant was an emotional moment that I'd been anticipating for months. The legal nightmare was finally over, but the practical challenges of rebuilding my life were just beginning. The damage Marcus had caused extended far beyond the criminal charges, affecting my career, my finances, my relationships, and my sense of trust in the people closest to me. The financial recovery process proved to be almost as complex as the criminal investigation had been. While my personal accounts were unfrozen immediately after the charges were dropped, untangling the business, finances, and recovering assets that had been seized during the investigation required months of additional legal work. The IRS and state tax authorities had to conduct their own investigations to determine which financial obligations were legitimate and which were the result of fraudulent activities. Marcus had been sophisticated in mixing legitimate business income with fraudulent financial activities, making it difficult to separate legal obligations from the proceeds of criminal enterprises. Martinez Business Solutions had generated substantial revenue from actual consulting work, which meant that some tax obligations were real even though the business had been operated fraudulently. Determining my liability for these obligations required detailed analysis of every transaction and client relationship. Rebecca worked with tax attorneys and forensic accountants to establish a framework for resolving the financial issues, without requiring me to pay obligations that resulted from Marcus's criminal activities. The process involved detailed negotiations with multiple government agencies and extensive documentation of the fraud Marcus had perpetrated. Eventually, we reached settlements that acknowledged my victim status while addressing the legitimate tax obligations associated with the business income. The professional consequences of the investigation were more difficult to address than the legal and financial issues. Even though I'd been completely exonerated and officially recognized as a victim of identity theft, The mere fact of having been investigated for financial crimes had damaged my reputation in the forensic accounting community. The field required absolute integrity and trustworthiness, and any association with financial fraud, even as a victim, raised questions about my judgment and reliability. My employer, the California State Controller's Office, conducted their own internal investigation before deciding whether to reinstate me to my position. While they ultimately concluded that I'd done nothing wrong and had been victimized by sophisticated criminal activities, they expressed concerns about potential conflicts of interest if I continued working on financial fraud cases. The publicity surrounding my situation had made me recognizable to defense attorneys and potential defendants, which could complicate future prosecutions. After extensive discussions with my supervisors and human resources representatives, we agreed that I would transfer to a different division within the Controller's Office, focusing on audit and compliance work rather than criminal investigations. The transfer allowed me to maintain my employment and continue using my accounting skills, but it effectively ended my career as a forensic accountant, specializing in fraud detection. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's crimes had not only made me a victim of financial fraud, but had also ended my career fighting financial fraud. His actions had stolen not just my identity and financial security, but also my professional purpose, and the work that had given my life meaning. Even in defeat, he'd managed to take away something precious that I'd worked years to build. David had remained supportive throughout the legal ordeal, but the stress of the investigation and the uncertainty about my future had strained our relationship in ways that became apparent only after the immediate crisis had passed. The experience had changed me in fundamental ways, making me more cautious, more suspicious, and less trusting of the people around me. David struggled to understand why I couldn't simply return to normal once my name had been cleared and the legal issues had been resolved. The trauma of such complete betrayal by someone I'd trusted unconditionally had affected my ability to maintain intimate relationships, even with people who had demonstrated their loyalty and support during the worst period of my life. Dr. Walsh helped me understand that this was a normal response to the type of complex trauma I had experienced, but recognizing the psychological impact didn't make it easier to overcome. David and I eventually made the difficult decision to end our romantic relationship. Though we remained friends and maintained mutual respect for what we'd meant to each other, he'd been a source of strength during the darkest period of my life, but we both recognized that I needed time and space to heal from Marcus's betrayal before I could fully commit to building a future with someone else. The emotional healing process was longer and more complex than I'd anticipated. Even after the legal issues were resolved and my financial situation had stabilized, I continued to struggle with feelings of anger, grief, and confusion about Marcus's betrayal. The brother I'd loved and protected for over 2 decades had never really existed, and mourning the loss of that relationship while processing the reality of what he'd actually done required extensive therapeutic work. Dr. Walsh helped me understand that my grief was legitimate and necessary, even though Marcus was still alive and the relationship I was mourning had been based on deception. The love I'd felt for him had been real, and the protective instincts that had made me vulnerable to his manipulation had been expressions of genuine family loyalty. The fact that he'd exploited these positive qualities didn't make them weaknesses or mistakes on my part. Gradually, I began to rebuild my sense of self and my capacity for trust, starting with small steps and carefully chosen relationships. The process was slow and sometimes frustrating, but I eventually began to recognize that Marcus's betrayal said nothing about my worth as a person or my judgment in other relationships. He'd been skilled at manipulation and deception, targeting qualities that were strengths rather than weaknesses. The legal proceedings against Marcus moved forward slowly, complicated by his attempts to negotiate plea agreements and his lawyers' efforts to minimize his culpability by blaming his victims for enabling his crimes. His defense strategy involved portraying himself as someone who'd struggled with addiction and mental health issues, suggesting that his criminal behavior had been the result of illness rather than calculated predatory conduct. I was called to testify during Marcus's sentencing hearing, providing a victim impact statement that described the personal and professional damage his crimes had caused. Standing in the courtroom and looking directly at my brother while describing how his actions had destroyed my career and damaged my ability to trust other people was one of the most difficult things I'd ever done. Marcus showed no emotion during my testimony, maintaining the same detached, calculating demeanor that had apparently characterized his approach to victimizing the people who loved him. There was no apology, no expression of remorse, no acknowledgement of responsibility for the pain he'd caused. His complete lack of empathy or accountability confirmed that the person I'd thought was my brother had been a fiction created to facilitate his criminal activities. The judge sentenced Marcus to 15 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and restitution payments to his victims. The sentence was substantial, but felt inadequate, given the scope of his crimes and the number of lives he'd damaged. 15 years seemed like a small price to pay for systematically destroying the financial security and professional reputations of dozens of innocent people who'd trusted him. The restitution payments were largely symbolic since Marcus had spent most of the money he'd stolen and would have limited earning capacity while incarcerated. The practical reality was that his victims would bear most of the financial consequences of his crimes, even though he'd been held legally accountable for his actions. Justice had been served in the criminal courts, but the practical impact on victims' lives couldn't be fully addressed through the legal system. As the court proceedings concluded, and Marcus was led away to begin his prison sentence, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness that surprised me with its intensity. The legal chapter of this ordeal was finally closing, but the emotional and practical consequences would continue affecting my life for years to come. Marcus would eventually be released from prison and would presumably attempt to rebuild his life, while his victims would continue dealing with the long-term consequences of his betrayal. The financial recovery process continued for nearly 2 years after Marcus's conviction, involving complex negotiations with insurance companies, government agencies, and financial institutions to determine liability for various obligations and damages. While I eventually recovered most of my personal assets and avoided responsibility for the fraudulent business obligations, the process was expensive and time-consuming, requiring continued legal representation and extensive documentation. My new position in the audit division of the Controller's Office proved to be professionally satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. While I missed the investigative aspects of forensic accounting, the compliance and oversight work allowed me to use my analytical skills to help ensure that government agencies were operating efficiently and transparently. The work felt meaningful and important, even though it was different from what I'd originally planned for my career. The experience of being victimized by financial fraud had given me unique insights into the psychological and practical impacts of these crimes, perspectives that proved valuable in my new role. I became an advocate within the Controller's Office for policies and procedures that would better protect victims of identity theft and financial fraud, drawing on my personal experience to inform policy recommendations. 3 years after Marcus's conviction, I received an unexpected letter from him while he was serving his federal sentence. The letter was brief and seemed to be an attempt at reconciliation, suggesting that he'd gained perspective on his actions and wanted to make amends for the damage he'd caused. He wrote about participating in counseling programs while incarcerated, and claimed to have developed empathy for his victims that he'd lacked when committing his crimes. I read the letter several times, looking for signs of genuine remorse or accountability, but found only the same manipulative language and self-serving explanations that had characterized his communication throughout our relationship. The letter focused more on his own suffering and rehabilitation than on the impact of his crimes on his victims. It seemed designed to elicit sympathy and potentially set the stage for future requests for assistance or forgiveness. After discussing the letter with Dr. Walsh, I decided not to respond to Marcus's attempted communication. Any relationship between us would inevitably be based on the power dynamic he'd established through years of manipulation and exploitation, and maintaining contact would prevent me from fully healing from the trauma of his betrayal. The brother I'd loved had never really existed, and the person who'd written this letter was a convicted criminal who'd systematically destroyed my life for his own gain. Dr. Walsh helped me understand that forgiveness didn't require maintaining a relationship with Marcus or even communicating with him directly. I could release my anger and resentment for my own emotional health without exposing myself to further manipulation or providing him with opportunities to continue exploiting my compassionate nature. Forgiveness was something I could do for myself, not something I owed to him regardless of his apparent rehabilitation efforts. The process of rebuilding my life after such complete betrayal had been more challenging and transformative than I'd ever imagined possible. The experience had changed my fundamental understanding of family relationships, professional integrity, and personal security in ways that were both painful and ultimately beneficial. I'd learned to trust my instincts more completely while also recognizing the sophisticated techniques that predatory people use to exploit others. Goodwill. My relationship with our mother had also evolved in complex ways as she struggled to reconcile her love for both of her children with the reality of what Marcus had done. She'd initially been skeptical of the charges against him, hoping that there'd been some misunderstanding or that he'd been wrongly accused. Learning about the full scope of his criminal activities and the calculated way he'd victimized his own family had been devastating for her. Carmen eventually sought her own counseling to process the grief and confusion of learning that one of her children had systematically exploited and damaged the other. She struggled with feelings of guilt about potentially enabling Marcus's behavior through years of making excuses for his irresponsibility and failing to hold him accountable for his actions. The family dynamics that had allowed Marcus to operate as a predator had been subtle and well established, making it difficult for any of us to recognize the warning signs. Our relationship gradually healed as we both acknowledged that Marcus had been skilled at manipulating family loyalties and exploiting our love for him. Neither of us had been equipped to recognize or respond to such sophisticated criminal behavior, and blaming ourselves for failing to detect his deception would only compound the damage he'd already caused. 5 years after the initial crisis, I'd established a new life that was different from what I'd originally planned, but satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. My career in government audit work had advanced steadily, and I'd developed expertise in areas that were personally meaningful and professionally challenging. The experience of being victimized by financial crimes had given me unique qualifications for helping develop policies and procedures that would better protect other potential victims. I'd also begun dating again, approaching new relationships with greater caution but also with deeper appreciation for honesty and authenticity. The experience with Marcus had taught me to value directness and transparency over charm and charisma, leading me to form connections with people who demonstrated their integrity through consistent actions rather than persuasive words. My current partner, Jennifer Kim, is a social worker who specializes in helping families affected by financial crimes and domestic violence. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, built on mutual respect and shared values, rather than romantic intensity or dramatic gestures. Jennifer understood the psychological impact of betrayal and manipulation from her professional experience, which helped her support my continued healing process without pressuring me to move faster than I was comfortable with. The financial recovery had eventually been complete, allowing me to rebuild my savings and plan for a secure future. The years of legal fees and lost income had been costly, but insurance settlements and restitution payments had offset much of the immediate financial damage. More importantly, I'd learned to structure my financial life in ways that would provide better protection against future fraud attempts. I'd also become involved in advocacy work with organizations that support identity theft victims and promote stronger laws and enforcement mechanisms for financial crimes. My experience as both a forensic accounting professional and a victim of sophisticated fraud provided a unique perspective that was valuable for policy development and victim support programs. The advocacy work had been personally meaningful and professionally rewarding, allowing me to channel the anger and frustration from my experience into constructive efforts to help other victims and prevent similar crimes. Speaking at conferences and training sessions about the psychological and practical impacts of identity theft had helped me process my own trauma while educating others about the warning signs and protective measures that could reduce their vulnerability. Marcus had been released from federal prison after serving 12 years of his 15-year sentence, having earned early release through participation in rehabilitation programs and good behavior while incarcerated. I'd received notification of his release as required by victim rights laws, but I had no desire to learn about his current activities or whereabouts. His release marked the official end of the criminal justice process, but it had no bearing on my own life or recovery. The experience of being victimized by someone I'd trusted completely had been devastating and transformative, forcing me to rebuild my understanding of family relationships, professional identity, and personal security from the ground up. The process had been more difficult and taken longer than I'd ever imagined, but it had ultimately resulted in a life that was more authentic, more secure, and more meaningful than what I'd had before Marcus's betrayal. The qualities that had made me vulnerable to his manipulation, my loyalty, compassion, and willingness to support family members, were still part of my character, but I'd learned to apply them more carefully and with better boundaries. I'd discovered that protecting myself from predatory people didn't require becoming cynical or suspicious, but rather developing better skills for recognizing authentic relationships and trustworthy behavior. Looking back on the entire ordeal, I could see how Marcus's systematic exploitation of our family relationship had been both deeply personal and coldly calculating. He'd stolen not just my identity and financial security, but also my innocence about the potential for evil within family bonds. The recovery process had required not just legal vindication and financial restitution, but a complete reconstruction of my understanding of trust, loyalty, and family obligation. The most important lesson I'd learned was that family relationships, like all relationships, must be based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than unquestioning loyalty or obligation. The people who deserve our trust are those who demonstrate their worthiness through consistent, honest behavior over time, not those who demand it based on blood relationships or emotional manipulation. Marcus's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been educational in ways that had ultimately made me stronger, wiser, and more capable of building authentic relationships with people who genuinely deserved my trust and loyalty. The brother I'd thought I had never really existed, but the family I'd built with people who truly cared about my well-being was more valuable and secure than anything I'd lost. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.